They were certain their tanks were unstoppable. The Type 95 Hago had proven itself against Chinese troops, against Soviet armor at Khalkhin Gol, and during sweeping campaigns across Malaya and the Philippines. Japanese tank crews believed their light tanks represented the peak of armored warfare design, perfectly suited for the jungles and islands of the Pacific. They had crushed every enemy they met. They were mistaken. Their realization began not in defeat, but in the confidence born from years of victory. The Hago was no accident of design. It was the result of careful military planning that began in 1933, when the Imperial Japanese Army identified a critical gap in its armored forces. The Type 89 medium tank, Japan's workhorse, could only reach 15 mph. That was fine for infantry support, but far too slow for the mechanized warfare Japan envisioned. Military planners, watching other nations develop faster, more mobile armored forces, wanted a tank that could match motorized infantry moving 40 meters apiece by truck, traverse the rough terrain of Manchuria and China, and be mass-produced within Japan's limited industrial capacity. In July 1933, the Army Technical Bureau issued specifications: a 7-ton tank with a 37mm gun, top speed of 40 km/h, armor-proof against rifles and machine guns, and a simple, low-cost design. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries won the contract, and engineer Tomio Hara, already known for the Type 89, led the project. His key innovation was the bell crank suspension, a simple yet effective system that became standard on Japanese tanks for the next decade. By June 1934, the first prototype was complete. Field trials in Manchuria and Japan impressed observers. It reached 45 km/h on roads, 25-30 km/h cross-country, and turned with remarkable agility for its size. The suspension's bell crank system absorbed shocks well, letting it traverse terrain that would stop other vehicles. Mechanically, it was dependable, powered by a Mitsubishi 6-cylinder air-cooled diesel engine, producing 120 HP at 1,800 RPM. The diesel engine reduced fire risk compared to gasoline models and used more readily available fuel across Japan's empire. With 34 gallons of fuel, the tank could run 8 to 10 hours, covering about 130 miles on roads. Trials exposed issues. The suspension caused pitching on rough ground, making aiming difficult and tiring crews. Engineers added braces between bogies, creating the Manchurian suspension, which improved but didn't eliminate the rough ride. In 1935, at an Army Technical Bureau meeting, the Type 95 was proposed as the main tank for mechanized infantry. Infantry officers objected that 12 mm of armor was too thin for assaults on fortifications. Cavalry officers countered that speed and mobility outweighed armor and that its firepower was sufficient. After debate, the infantry accepted the design. The Type 95 Hago was officially adopted, 95 marking the 95th year since Japan's legendary founding. Production began at Mitsubishi in 1936. The Hago was a compact tank, 4.38 meters long, 2.06 meters wide, 2.13 meters tall, 14.4, 6.9, just under 7 ft. An average man could see over the turret. It weighed 7.4 tons empty, 8.1 tons fully loaded. Armor was thin, 12 mm at the turret and hull front, 9 mm on roof and floor, 6 mm elsewhere, enough to stop bullets, but not larger rounds. Designed for lightly armed foes, it fit the wars Japan expected to fight. Inside, the cramped crew of 3 worked in tight quarters. The driver sat front left with limited visibility through small ports. To his right, the hull machine gunner operated a Type 97 7.7mm gun in a ball mount. The commander manned the turret alone, standing on the floor without a basket, handling the 37mm main gun and another machine gun. His duties were exhausting, commanding, aiming, loading, and communicating, when a radio was even present. Only 1 in 4 tanks had a radio, leaving the others to follow visual signals. He also had to operate the main armament, a Type 94 37mm cannon capable of firing both high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds. He had to load this gun himself, a difficult physical task in the cramped turret while standing upright. In addition, he managed a second machine gun mounted to the rear of the turret, offset to the right at about the 5 o'clock position. American tank crews, who later examined captured Haigos, were astonished that anyone could fight effectively under such conditions. The Japanese commander had no seat. He stood throughout combat, either exposed from the open hatch for visibility or confined inside with almost no view. The turret was hand-cranked and required considerable strength to turn. Space was minimal, barely enough to move, let alone fight efficiently. Yet within its intended role and against its expected foes, the Haigo performed impressively. It first saw major combat in China beginning in 1937, where opposing forces had virtually no tanks and only limited anti-tank weapons. The Haigo was devastating. Its 37mm cannon leveled fortifications, its machine guns tore through infantry, and its speed allowed it to exploit breakthroughs and chase retreating troops. Japanese crews gained skill and confidence, believing their tank superior to all others. This success bred a dangerous illusion that the Haigo was a truly capable design rather than one tailored for lightly armed enemies. That belief was tested at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, when Japan clashed with the Soviet Union on the Mongolian border. There, the Haigo faced genuine opposition. Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks armed with 45mm guns that easily outranged and outpenetrated the Japanese 37 meters. Soviet armor was thicker, and frontal duels favored the enemy. On July 2, 1939, Japan's 3rd Tank Regiment, mostly equipped with Type 95s, attacked Soviet lines. Aggressive tactics and surprise brought early success. 32 Soviet tanks destroyed and 35 captured, but Soviet counterattacks soon exposed the Haigo's frailty. Soviet shells pierced Japanese armor at distances where the Type 95's guns could barely scratch Soviet tanks. By campaign's end, Japan had lost dozens of vehicles. The lesson was unmistakable. The Haigo was outclassed by modern armor, its thin plating and small gun inadequate for peer-level combat. Yet these findings went largely unheeded. Instead of redesigning their tanks, Japanese leaders emphasized tactics and training. In China, the Haigo continued to perform well, and complacency set in. When war erupted across the Pacific in December 1941, Japanese tank units again found success. In Malaya, Haigos maneuvered through terrain British commanders deemed impassable, pushing through jungles and rubber plantations to drive rapidly toward Singapore. British forces, lacking armor, were unprepared for this mobile assault. In the Philippines, Haigos landed with invasion forces and supported infantry operations. On December 22, 1941, north of Damortis, Type 95s fought American M3 Stuart light tanks in the first tank-on-tank engagement involving U.S. forces in the Pacific. Both had 37mm guns, but the M3's armor, 32mm on the turret sides versus the Haigo's 12mm, gave it the advantage. Still, at close range in jungle fighting, the Japanese destroyed one M3, reinforcing their belief in the Haigo's strength. From their viewpoint, the tank performed flawlessly, fast, reliable, and effective in supporting infantry through rough terrain. Crews trusted their machines. Commanders relied on them. So when ordered to defend Saipan, they brought their tanks without hesitation. Saipan, however, would prove different. Situated in the Mariana Islands, just 250 miles from Tokyo, it was critical. If captured, US B-29 bombers could strike Japan directly. The empire's leaders understood this and fortified the island with some 30,000 troops, nearly twice what American intelligence estimated. Among them was the 9th Tank Regiment, commanded by Colonel Takashi Goto. It fielded 44 tanks, a mix of Type 95 Haigos and the slightly larger Type 97 Chiha mediums. The Chihas carried 57mm guns, but shared the same thin armor typical of Japanese design. Together, these vehicles formed a supposedly powerful armored force, one soon to face its harshest test yet. Armored force by Pacific standards, certainly the largest the Americans had faced so far. The U.S. assault began on June 15, 1944. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner ordered the landing force ashore at 05:42 hours. By 0700, landing craft were heading toward the beaches. At 0840, the first wave hit the shore. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions landed on Saipan's western beaches under intense artillery and mortar fire from Japanese positions on the high ground overlooking the landing zones. The Marines fought inland through fierce resistance. By nightfall on the 15th, roughly 20,000 American troops were ashore, and equipment and supplies were pouring onto the beaches. Among them were M4 Sherman medium tanks, landing from LSTs to support the infantry. The Marines had secured a beachhead, but it remained under threat. Japanese artillery still reached the shore, and counterattacks persisted throughout the night. On June 16th, the Marines strengthened their lines and pushed further inland. The 2nd Marine Division closed gaps in the front, while the 4th cleared key terrain. General Holland Smith, commanding the invasion, brought in his reserves, elements of the 27th Infantry Division, to reinforce the position. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding Japanese forces on Saipan, saw the danger. If the Americans established a solid foothold and brought their full power ashore, driving them out would be impossible. He decided to strike before that could happen. Saito ordered a massive counterattack using his strongest remaining assets, the infantry of the 136th Regiment and the tanks of the 9th Tank Regiment. The plan was clear. The infantry would assault American positions around the Karan-Kanoa airfield, while the tanks would move southwest of Hill 164.6. After the infantry began their attack, the tanks would charge the U.S. transmitting station, disrupt defenses, and create openings for the infantry to break through. It was a bold plan, demanding close coordination in a night attack across difficult terrain. Colonel Takashi Goto gathered his tank crews. They performed final maintenance, loaded ammunition, 37mm shells for the Hagos, 57mm for the Chiha tanks, topped off fuel, adjusted tracks, and tested radios in the few tanks equipped with them. Many crews were veterans of China or earlier Pacific campaigns. They trusted their training, their machines, and their commander. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 17th, diesel engines roared to life, echoing across the hills. Tracks clattered as 44 tanks, the largest armored force Japan had ever fielded in the Pacific, rolled toward the American lines. Inside the cramped hulls, crews felt the rumble of motion. Commanders stood in their turrets, peering into the night and signaling with lamps and flags. The Americans heard them coming. Marine sentries reported engine noises from the north. Officers barked orders as men grabbed weapons and took defensive positions. Anti-tank gunners swung their 37mm M3s toward the sound. Sherman crews scrambled into their tanks and started engines. Machine gun teams checked belts and positions. At 0330 hours, the Japanese attack struck in full force. 44 tanks advanced toward the 2nd Marine Division's perimeter, some carrying infantry riding on the hulls, a risky but occasionally effective tactic. The formation pushed through the dark, guided by lead tanks along the uneven ground. Marines spotted shadowy shapes emerging from the gloom, accompanied by the thunder of diesel engines, clanking bogies, and grinding tracks. Japanese gunners opened fire, sweeping the terrain with their hull-mounted machine guns. Others held fire, hoping to close the distance. Then came something unexpected, something that would change how Marines viewed Japanese tanks for the rest of the war. Marine machine gunners opened up, not with the usual 30-caliber weapons, but with Browning M2 50-caliber heavy machine guns. These were not infantry support guns. They were anti-aircraft and anti-vehicle weapons. The Browning M2, perfected between the wars, fired a 12.7mm round at over 2,900 feet per second. Its ammunition included standard ball rounds and armor-piercing types designed specifically to pierce light armor and bunkers. The armor-piercing 50 caliber round could penetrate 23 mm of face-hardened steel at 200 meters and still punch through 19 mm at 500. These weren't theoretical numbers. They came from verified U.S. Ordnance test data. The weapon had been developed to destroy lightly armored vehicles. Aircraft and vehicles, not tanks. But the mathematics of armor penetration were absolute. The Type 95 Hay-Go's armor measured just 12 millimeters at its thickest on the turret front and sides. The upper hull shared the same maximum thickness. Simple calculation exposed the flaw. The 50 caliber armor-piercing round could penetrate nearly twice that amount at close range. And in this battle, at ranges under 200 meters, the Browning's rounds had more than enough power to pierce Japanese armor with ease. Marine gunners opened fire. Tracer rounds streaked across the dark battlefield in blazing orange arcs. The sound was unmistakable, the deep rhythmic boom-boom-boom of 50 caliber fire rolling across the line. Many Marines fired uncertainly, doubting that their weapons could harm tanks. What happened next stunned both sides. The armor-piercing rounds didn't bounce or dent. They sliced through the Hay-Go's thin plating cleanly, even punching through both sides of the hull at close range. At greater distances, the rounds still tore through the armor effortlessly. Inside the tanks, Japanese crews faced horror and disbelief. The loud clangs they were used to hearing in China had become deadly intrusions, rounds bursting through armor, ricocheting inside the cramped compartments, striking engines, ammunition, and men. The Hay-Go's face-hardened plates, once enough to stop rifle fire, meant nothing against the M2's heavy slugs. One Marine near the airfield reported seeing his tracers hit a Hay-Go charging directly toward him. Sparks flared inside through the vision slits. The tank rumbled forward another few yards, then slowed and stopped as smoke poured from its rear deck. Two crewmen bailed out and were immediately cut down by rifle fire. Another Marine, firing from a half-track at roughly 150 meters, poured a burst into the flank of an advancing tank. As the Hay-Go turned toward him, exposing more of its side, he kept firing, feeding fresh belts into the gun. Through his sights, he saw the commander slump in the turret. The bullet had gone through the armor, through the man, and out the other side. The commander never even realized what had happened. A third gunner, fixed in a defensive position, aimed for the engine deck of a Hay-Go. His rounds pierced the 6mm rear armor, shredding the diesel engine until it seized. The tank froze in place, then burst into smoke as the surviving crew fled under a hail of small arms fire. For Japanese tankers, the shock was profound. They had trained for years, fought in China where no bullet could pierce their armor, survived encounters with Soviet anti-tank rifles at Khalkhin Gol. Their tanks were supposed to protect them. That was the entire principle of armored warfare. But now, machine guns, ordinary infantry weapons, were destroying them. Not anti-tank cannons, not artillery, not the 75mm guns of the Sherman tanks approaching in the distance. Machine guns mounted on jeeps, trucks, and every American vehicle were tearing them apart. The psychological blow was crushing. One Japanese officer, later captured after his tank was disabled, told interrogators that he believed the Americans had invented a new secret weapon, some kind of advanced ammunition or special gun disguised as a normal machine gun. He could not accept that a standard weapon like the Browning M2 could pierce tank armor. In all his combat experience, bullets had never penetrated a tank. They only rattled harmlessly against the hull. But the Browning M2 was unlike any firearm the Japanese had faced. Its 50 caliber, armor-piercing rounds carried enough energy to defeat 12 of steel at any range where a gunner could aim accurately. And the Americans had them everywhere, on jeeps, half-tracks, trucks, and tanks. As the Japanese assault collapsed under the withering 50 caliber fire, Marine Shermans advanced to finish the job. The contrast between the two tanks was staggering. The Hago weighed just 7.4 tons. The M4A2 Sherman, used by the Marines on Saipan, weighed 31.8 tons. The Hago's 12-meter armor stood no chance against the Sherman's 51 glaciers, angled at 56 degrees to give an effective thickness of roughly 75 mm. And while the Hago carried a 37mm gun, the Sherman mounted a powerful 75mm cannon that could obliterate it with a single hit. Its main armament, a 75mm gun capable of piercing a Hago's armor from more than a mile away. When the Shermans opened fire, the outcome was already sealed. Their 75mm armor-piercing shells struck Hagos and Chihas with catastrophic force. Tanks erupted into flames. Turrets were blown off hulls, and ammunition detonated inside the cramped crew spaces. The Japanese returned fire, but their 30mm and 57mm guns were useless against the Sherman's thick frontal armor. Shells ricocheted or left shallow dents without penetrating. One Japanese commander, whose Hago had been crippled by 50 caliber hits but could still rotate its turret, tried to engage a Sherman at close range. He ordered his gunner to fire. The 37mm shell struck the Sherman's turret front with a flash, but the American tank didn't even slow. Its turret turned smoothly, aimed and fired a single 75mm round. The Hago vanished in an explosion. The scene descended into chaos, what one Marine officer later called a madhouse of noise. Tracers and flashing lights. Disabled tanks burned brightly, casting eerie light over others still trying to advance. Infantry who had clung to the tank's hulls leapt off and scattered into shell holes and ditches. Some Japanese soldiers reached the Marine lines, fighting desperate close-quarters battles among foxholes and sandbag walls. Marines crouched as tanks rolled directly overhead. One Marine recalled a Hago leaking oil onto him as it passed. He waited until it moved on, then hurled a thermite grenade into its engine deck, setting it ablaze from within. Another Marine, lying low as a tank crossed his position, leapt out and jammed a coconut log into its bogie wheels. The track spun helplessly, spraying dirt. When the commander opened the hatch to see the problem, the Marine climbed up and dropped a thermite grenade inside. The tank detonated, its ammunition igniting in a fiery blast. By mid-morning on June 17th, the counterattack was finished. 31 Japanese tanks lay destroyed on the battlefield, later counted by Marines combing the area. Some reports suggest as many as 35 were lost, when including those shattered by artillery beyond the immediate front. Around 1,000 Japanese troops were dead, including most of the tank crews and accompanying infantry. For the Marines, victory was decisive but costly. They had repelled a massive armored assault, but only barely. The 2nd Marine Division's commander later admitted that, had the Japanese broken through, his division might have ceased to function as a fighting force. The battle's outcome owed as much to American firepower and Japanese missteps as to numerical superiority. Yet when Marines walked among the wrecks afterward, another truth became clear. The Japanese tanks were not the fearsome machines they had imagined. When Marine officer called his men over to a destroyed Hago and pointed out neat round holes in the armor, clean entries where 50 caliber rounds had punched through. The exits on the opposite side were larger and jagged, torn outward by bullets that had passed completely through. Some openings were wide enough to fit a fist. Inside the wreck, the scene was grim. The cramped compartment bore evidence of multiple penetrations. The commander's turret position had no real protection. The hand-cranked traverse was primitive, and the gun controls were rudimentary. The hull gunner sat in a stifling corner with almost no view. The driver's station offered only a crude periscope and tiny slit. Everything inside was tight, unsophisticated, and completely exposed to 50 caliber fire. Marines who had fought at Guadalcanal 2 years earlier remembered encountering Hagos there. Then, armed mainly with rifles and grenades, those tanks had seemed terrifying. But now, with Shermans and heavy weapons, the Hago looked exactly as it was, a light tank of the mid-1930s, suited to colonial wars, not to modern mechanized combat. For Japanese crews, the psychological shock was immense. Captured survivors spoke in disbelief. Their tanks hadn't merely been defeated, they had been rendered obsolete. Machines they once trusted with their lives had offered no protection against weapons the Americans treated as routine. U.S. intelligence officers noted the same reaction across many interrogations: astonishment at the Americans' overwhelming firepower, at the abundance and reliability of their equipment, and at the almost casual ease with which the Marines had destroyed what Japan had once considered invincible. Abundance of ammunition and supplies they had witnessed. Many spoke bitterly of betrayal, of being sent into battle with hopelessly inadequate equipment while their leaders claimed Japan possessed technological parity. One veteran tank commander, who had fought in China since 1937, told interrogators he once believed Japan would triumph through sheer fighting spirit and devotion to the emperor. But after Saipan, after watching his tank shredded by machine gun fire and seeing American Shermans shrug off Japanese rounds, he understood that courage could not overcome material inferiority. Training and bravery meant little when the weapons themselves were obsolete. These interrogation reports were analyzed and distributed across the Pacific. The lessons from Saipan quickly reshaped Marine tactics. Japanese tanks were no longer considered a significant threat. Standard infantry heavy weapons, especially the .50 caliber Browning, proved more than sufficient. Combined with bazookas, 37mm anti-tank guns, and Sherman tanks, Marines possessed crushing firepower. The message spread rapidly. You didn't need specialized anti-tank weapons to destroy Japanese armor. Your .50 caliber could do the job. This realization transformed how Marines approached future island battles. The dread of enemy armor evaporated. Japanese tanks became just another target, and not a dangerous one. The Battle of Saipan dragged on for weeks after the failed counterattack. Marines and Army units fought bitterly through every mile of terrain, from sugarcane fields and swamps to cliffs and volcanic ridges. Mount Tapachao, rising 1,154 feet above sea level, became a brutal focal point. Fighting in caves and ravines consumed both men and ammunition. On July 9, 1944, Saipan was finally declared secure. The victory had enormous strategic consequences. With the Marianas in U.S. hands, B-29 bombers could strike Tokyo directly. The psychological blow to Japan was immense. Emperor Hirohito recognized that Saipan's fall meant the homeland would soon be bombed. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned on July 18th, and for the first time, Japanese media admitted the war was turning against them. National confidence in victory was shattered. For Japanese tank crews across the Pacific, Saipan marked a grim turning point. Word of the defeat spread quickly through military channels. Crews on other islands learned what had happened. They knew their armor was useless, their guns ineffective, and that American firepower outclassed them completely. Yet they had no alternative. Japan lacked the resources to replace the Type 95 or Type 97 with modern designs. The country's industry, strangled by blockade and bombing, could not mass-produce newer tanks. American submarines had cut off vital raw materials from Southeast Asia. What little industry remained was devoted to aircraft for kamikaze, missions and coastal guns for homeland defense. Tank production was a low priority. Japanese engineers had designed better models, the Type 3 Chinu with a 75mm gun and the Type 4 Chito with even heavier armament, but they existed mostly as prototypes or in tiny numbers. Only 166 Chinus were ever built. Just 2 Chitos, and none reached combat. They were held in reserve for the final defense of Japan. Meanwhile, America's industrial output was beyond Japanese comprehension. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, built by Chrysler, was a purpose-designed factory for tank production. In December 1942 alone, its 5,000 workers rolled out 97 Shermans, more tanks in a single month than Japan produced in an entire year. And Detroit was only one part of a vast system. The Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, operated by General Motors' Fisher Body Division, produced over 11,000 Shermans in multiple versions, making it one of the world's highest volume tank plants. It could turn out hundreds of tanks each month at peak capacity. The American Locomotive Company in Schenectady, New York, shifted from trains to tanks, building 2,300 Shermans. Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia produced more than 1,200 while still manufacturing locomotives. Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio built the first production M4A1, nicknamed Michael, which was shipped to England and today remains preserved at the Bovington Tank Museum. Lima produced 1,655 Shermans before resuming train production. Other factories joined in: Pacific Car and Foundry in Washington State, Pressed Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania, Pullman Standard in Illinois, and Federal Machine and Welder in Ohio, all contributing to Sherman production. In total, 10 major manufacturers and countless subcontractors supplied the endless stream of components, tracks, engines, radios, optics, and armor plates that made American tank output unstoppable. Weapons. The scale of industrial mobilization that made them possible was unprecedented in human history. The Detroit Arsenal itself stood as a monument to modern production. Built on 567 acres in Warren, Michigan, it encompassed over 1.5 million square feet of manufacturing space. Assembly lines stretched for miles, while enormous overhead cranes lifted entire tank hulls between workstations. The plant ran around the clock, 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Its workforce combined experienced auto laborers who brought vital manufacturing skill with thousands of women who had never before worked in heavy industry. These women, immortalized as Rosie the Riveters, welded armor plate, assembled turrets, installed engines, and performed nearly every task except the heaviest lifting. They proved that America's industrial power could be multiplied by fully employing a previously untapped labor force. By the time production ended in June 1945, American factories had produced 49,234 Sherman tanks. Japan, by contrast, had built roughly 2,300 Hagos between 1936 and 1943, when production ceased. The ratio exceeded 20-1, and even that understated the difference, because the Shermans were far more capable individually. A Sherman weighed between 30 and 35 tons, depending on variant, with armor from 51 mm on the hull front to 76 mm on the turret mantlet. It carried a 5-man crew with clearly defined roles, featured a gyro-stabilized main gun that could fire on the move, and came equipped with radios in every vehicle for coordinated operations. It was rugged and dependable. Its tracks lasted about 2,500 miles, compared to 500 for German tanks and roughly 1,000 for Japanese ones. The Sherman was not the finest tank of World War II. German Tigers and Panthers outgunned it, but it was reliable, versatile, and produced in overwhelming numbers. In the Pacific, where it faced Japanese armor conceived in the mid-1930s, it was not merely sufficient, it was dominant. For Japanese tank crews on later islands, the grim pattern that began at Saipan continued. On Tinian in July 1944, 7 Type 95s were destroyed in failed counterattacks against marine lines. On Peleliu that September, Japanese tanks were entombed in caves and used as fixed pillboxes. Their crews acknowledging mobile combat was futile. On Iwo Jima, in February 1945, Colonel Takechi Nishi's 26th Tank Regiment buried its tanks up to their turrets in volcanic ash, turning them into static bunkers because they were safer not moving. Even then, they were far from safe. 50 caliber machine guns could still pierce turret armor. Flamethrower tanks poured fire into hatches and viewports, incinerating crews in seconds. Bazookas could penetrate their thin plating from any angle. The Hago, once a proud emblem of Japan's armored force, had become a steel coffin. On Okinawa, the final great battle of the Pacific War, Japan's 27th Tank Regiment defended the island with just 13 Type 95 Hagos and 14 Type 97 Chihas, 27 tanks in all. The Americans landed with over 800 tanks. The numerical gap was 30-1, the qualitative gap was even wider. On May 4th of 1945, the Japanese launched a massive counteroffensive, committing their armor to support an infantry push. It was annihilated within hours. Most tanks were destroyed by a combination of Shermans, bazookas, 37mm anti-tank guns, artillery, and 50-caliber machine guns. Those that survived withdrew, leaving smoldering wrecks across the battlefield. When the Soviet Union declared war on Japan in August 1945 and invaded Manchuria, Japanese tankers once again faced a far superior foe. Soviet T-34s, with their sloped armor and powerful 76mm guns, completely outclassed them. In the Battle of Shumshu, part of the Kuril chain, Japanese defenders fielded about 77 tanks, mostly Type 97s and Type 1 mediums, with just 25 Type 95s. The Soviets, employing 45mm anti-tank guns, rifles and grenades with deadly precision, destroyed 21 tanks in 2 hours. Hardened by years on the Eastern Front, Soviet crews tore through Japanese resistance with ease. For Japan's tank soldiers, especially in the war's closing years, the experience was one of slow, crushing realization. Everything they had been taught, the belief in their machines, in Japanese skill, in spiritual strength overcoming material weakness, collapsed under the reality of modern mechanized warfare. Their moment of truth came not in heroic tank duels, but in the horrifying simplicity of watching machine gun bullets punch through the armor that was supposed to protect them. For the Marines who fought at Saipan and every island after, the lessons were different but equally enduring. They learned that Japanese tanks were not a serious threat. They learned that proper equipment and overwhelming firepower made all the difference. They discovered that their familiar 50-caliber machine guns, tools they had trained with for years, were in the Pacific potent anti-tank weapons when used against thin-skinned Japanese armor. There was no sense of glory in these one-sided fights. Marines didn't feel heroic shooting tanks with machine guns and watching them burn. They felt relief that they didn't face the armored juggernauts their comrades met in Europe. Pity for the Japanese crews trapped in hopeless machines, and grim satisfaction knowing their weapons worked, that American industry had provided what they needed to survive. After the war, several captured Hago tanks were shipped to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland for study. American ordnance engineers examined them closely over months, taking precise measurements and detailed photographs. They recorded armor thickness at multiple points. Front hull, 12 mm, sides, 12 mm, rear, 10 to 12 mm, turret front, 12 mm, turret sides, 12 mm, roof, 9 mm, and belly, 6 mm. Metallurgical tests revealed face-hardened steel. Its surface toughened to shatter rifle bullets, but easily breached by larger projectiles that broke through the brittle layer and punched into the softer core beneath. The internal analysis was even more telling. The fighting compartment offered barely 50 cubic feet of space for the commander, who had to stand the entire time, no seat, no rest, operating every turret function alone. The turret ring measured just 200 millimeters, so cramped that movement was nearly impossible while loading, firing, and commanding. The driver's position measured about 2 feet wide by 3 feet deep, with only the simplest controls, 2 steering levers, a throttle, and a gear shifter. His visibility came from a tiny periscope and a small vision port, usable only in non-combat situations. The hull machine gunner beside him had even less room, crammed into a narrow recess with his weapon, and a few ammunition belts. Two American tankers accustomed to the Sherman, such conditions seemed unimaginable. The Sherman's fighting compartment offered more than 150 cubic feet, 3 times as much space. Every crewman had a defined position and proper seat. The commander had a cupola with full all-around vision blocks. The gunner used a telescopic sight with powered turret traverse. The loader had space to move and organized ammunition racks. And both driver and bow gunner, assistant driver, had ample room and better optics. The Aberdeen tests confirmed what the Marines already knew from battle and what physics had long made obvious. The Hago was a light tank, adequate only for fighting poorly equipped enemies. It was useful for colonial policing or anti-guerrilla actions, not for industrial warfare against a modern army. Any weapon stronger than a rifle could destroy it. The .50 caliber armor-piercing round didn't just penetrate, it tore through with energy to spare, sometimes punching clean holes from one side to the other. Even without enemy fire, the tank's internal design endangered its crew. The commander's workload, aiming, firing, loading and commanding, was unmanageable. With radios in only 1 out of every 4 vehicles, coordination between tanks was nearly impossible. The hand-cranked turret traverse was painfully slow, and the vision systems crude and inadequate. Every aspect of the Hago reflected Japan's industrial limits, resource shortages, and a design mindset shaped by early successes against weak opponents. In contrast, the Sherman embodied America's modern war philosophy. Where the Hago was cramped, the Sherman was roomy enough for crews to move, swap roles, and fight efficiently for long periods. Where the Hago's thin armor could be pierced by machine gun fire, the Sherman's 51mm glacis, angled at 56 degrees, provided about 75mm of effective protection. And where the Hago's turret was manned by 1 overburdened soldier, the Sherman's turret housed 3, a commander, gunner, and loader. And the commander, with his 6 vision block cupola, could direct the battle while maintaining full situational awareness, as the gunner concentrated on precision aiming and the loader kept the 75mm cannon ready to fire, magnification optics, and a power traverse mechanism that rotated the turret smoothly and quickly. The loader's job was to sustain a high rate of fire, pulling shells from organized racks and chambering them with practiced efficiency. The Sherman's 75mm gun had a muzzle velocity of roughly 2,400 passes per second using standard ammunition, providing effective penetration against any armor it faced in the Pacific. It was gyro-stabilized on the vertical axis, allowing reasonably accurate fire even on the move, a feature the Hago entirely lacked. Each Sherman carried 97 rounds of 75mm ammunition stored safely in armored racks, while the Hago's 130 rounds of 37mm ammunition were stacked loosely throughout the fighting compartment. The difference in communications capability was equally dramatic. Every Sherman was equipped with an SCR-528 or SCR-538 radio, enabling tank-to-tank coordination and direct communication with infantry and artillery. The Hago had radios in only 1 out of 4 tanks. The rest relied on visual signals, flag and hand gestures easily lost amid smoke, confusion, and terrain. In vision systems, too, the gap was glaring. The Sherman featured periscopes with replaceable prisms, armored direct vision ports, and a commander's cupola offering full 360-degree visibility. The Hago relied on crude periscopes and tiny viewing slits that gave minimal awareness, forcing commanders to expose themselves through open hatches just to see the battlefield. Every design detail, from ammunition storage to fire control to ergonomics, favored the American tank. But the decisive difference went beyond individual vehicles. It was the industrial machinery behind them. The United States had built an economy capable of waging mechanized war on a global scale. Automobile factories became tank plants, operating at incredible speeds. The Detroit arsenal alone could produce more tanks in 1 month than Japan built in a year. Women by the thousands, many new to factory work, welded armor, machined turrets, and assembled engines. Engineers refined designs continuously, incorporating lessons from every battle. Supplies flowed in an unbroken chain, from raw materials to ports, where completed Shermans were shipped across both oceans. In the field, maintenance crews recovered damaged tanks, salvaged parts, and returned repaired machines to combat within days. Japan possessed no comparable system. Its economy was already exhausted by years of conflict in China before Pearl Harbor. Its factories lacked American automation and output. As Allied submarines severed shipping routes, raw materials dwindled. The empire that had dared to challenge the world's foremost industrial power was now paying the price with every new defeat. For the Japanese tank crews on Saipan that dawn in June 1944, and for every tanker who fought afterward, the truth was brutal and undeniable. They were obsolete, their machines were obsolete, their doctrine, shaped by earlier colonial wars, was obsolete. There was nothing they could do except keep fighting with what little they had, knowing survival was unlikely and victory impossible. The Marines facing them learned their own enduring lessons. They saw that industrial power wins modern wars, that superior equipment in overwhelming quantity outweighs courage alone. They learned that training and valor could not compensate for material inferiority, and that the factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland were as vital to victory as any battlefield heroism. They also gained a practical rule for combat. When you see a Japanese Heigo, you don't need to call in artillery or airstrikes. Engage it yourself with your .50 caliber machine gun. At ranges under 200 yards, armor-piercing rounds will slice through. Aim for the sides, turret, or engine deck. The bullets will punch straight through and disable the tank, killing or wounding its crew. The weapon meant for shooting down aircraft worked just as well on Japanese armor. It was a small, tactical discovery in a vast global conflict, but for the men involved, it brought unforgettable clarity. This was not a fair fight. It was not an even contest. It was the reality of industrialized warfare. One side with overwhelming production, the other with dwindling means. The result had never been in doubt. The Hago tanks of Saipan and of every island afterward came to symbolize more than outdated machinery. They represented the chasm between what Japan needed and what it could actually produce. They embodied the impossible burden placed on Japanese soldiers, ordered to fight a superpower with weapons designed for another era. They were the physical outcome of choices made years earlier, to favor ships and planes over ground armor, to believe spirit could offset steel, to mistake early success for enduring strength. When those first .50 caliber rounds punched through Heigo armor on Saipan, they proved something that echoed far beyond the battlefield, that in industrial war, production capacity matters, design philosophy matters, logistics and resources matter. No amount of bravery or skill can overcome a 10-to-1 disadvantage backed by superior technology. The Japanese tankers who climbed into their Heigos that June morning believed they rode into battle in dependable, capable machines. By nightfall on June 17th, they knew the truth. Their tanks were so thinly armored that machine gun bullets cut through like paper. They had been sent to wage a 1940s industrial war with 1930s tools, and there was nothing left for them to do but keep fighting, keep serving, and keep dying inside machines that could never protect them.